right? People may have wished that happened a little bit sooner. Of course, especially as kids, when you are as brutal a ruler as King Herod, you have some very large shoes to fill. Like we said, Herod may have been mean, but he seemed to be quite stable. And that means that taking over from Herod is going to be a bit of a challenge. And it becomes quite clear, again, through the text of Josephus, that his sons are unable to fill his shoes. The ones that are obviously still alive. And so this gets Rome really worried, because already there's instability in the empire. That was sort of, kind of the description of Herodian life right there. And so rather than look for another local king, the Romans decide to ship in their own guys. And this is when we get to the period of the procurators, or the prefects. The most famous one, of course, being Pontius Pilate, right? So there was a whole series of these guys who come in and rule on behalf of Rome. So if you thought you really didn't like the idea of Herod being your king, imagine how much more disappointed you are now that the new ruler has nothing to do with your culture, your society, maybe your religion, totally disconnected from the local Judeans. And so those rifts only grow, the anger builds, and this is where we get to that whole period of Pharisees, Sadducees, right? Increased tension amongst the Jews, which we talked about in Jerusalem. So how is that relevant to here? Because Josephus mentions that one of the zealot communities who went by a nickname in Jerusalem as the Sicari, meaning the dagger people, they were quite well known for stabbing their Jewish political opponents. They didn't like what you thought or how you reacted to Rome or how you lived your life. They would just kill you. Not the nicest folks in the world. They had quite the reputation, apparently, according to Josephus. And at some point in time, their very charismatic leader decides Jerusalem is going to hell in a handbasket. We want nothing to do with this place. We are going to extract ourselves and go live the perfect life where nobody can bother us. And so they, somewhere around the late 60s, right, just before the official kind of destruction of Jerusalem, they come out to Masada, and Josephus tells us they are able to take over the fortress from whatever military presence was left behind, because we are now talking about a good 60 years following the death of King Herod. So whatever stability or force Masada may have had under Herod apparently was no longer. So the zealots at this point, according to Josephus, number about 960 individuals, men, women, and children, who are all part of this extremist sect who come out here to live their happy life in the desert, away from all of the chaos that is about to, or maybe already envelops Jerusalem. Okay? Everybody more or less clear? Great. So what happens 66, 67? We have the official outbreak of the revolt, described in great detail by Josephus, who was there for the opening scene. He tells us in his autobiography that he was raised in Jerusalem as the son of a priest, but decided, I want to go and experiment in the world. Right? I don't want this sort of obvious path of priesthood. And so he ends up becoming the leader of the Jewish forces in the Galilee, which apparently was not his natural calling, because, as he admits, his first battle, he lost. That was it. He and his men got holed up in a cave. They were surrounded by Romans. He convinced some of his men to commit suicide rather than turn themselves over to the Romans, and then guess what he did? He turned himself over to the Romans. At that point, he becomes the official, or not so official, it's not clear, documentarian of the Roman revolt on Judea, and he basically follows them from the Galilee all the way down to Jerusalem. Right? At some point, he ends up shipping himself off to Rome. He gets adopted by the emperor, and he lives out the rest of his life in the palace. Tough life. While he's there, he is continuing to tell the story, and at that point, we're even less sure that we were at the beginning of his narrative, where he's getting his information from. But he still covers a lot of detail. And what he tells us about Masada is that at the end of the war in Jerusalem, around the year 70, right, the summer of 70, when the temple is destroyed and the walls are destroyed and there's really nothing left, theoretically, the Roman forces could have packed their bags and gone home. But they didn't. Because why? What do all of the outposts who are out here in the desert, because Masada was not the only one, what do they really want ultimately as their goal? Back to Jerusalem. And so if the Romans pack their bags and go home, the trouble's just going to start all over again in the next couple of years. And so the Romans get the order to send the 10th Legion down into the desert to root out every last outpost of Jewish community here. And so Masada then kind of becomes the feature story, given the challenge of taking the hilltop. You can't just sort of run up the side of the mountain and declare victory, especially when there are 1,000 people here at the top, perhaps, stockpiling or preparing for some sort of battle. And that's where we get the scene of the siege camps. The idea that we're in the desert, perhaps we can cut off their water, perhaps they have limited supplies on the top of the mountain. So we build the siege wall, we sit in the forts, and we simply wait until they run out of something. Patience, resources, who knows what. But once again, Josephus shares with us, that doesn't happen fast enough. And so the 10th Legion, which numbers somewhere in the vicinity of 10,000 men, 10,000 men camped out around Masada, are all running out of patience themselves or resources. And so they decide, we've had enough of the waiting, we are now going for the attacking. Okay? And so here's where it gets a little complicated. I'll show you a little picture. Because Romans don't just run up the mountain. They have a very formal approach to battle. And what they're going to do in this case, when you have a walled complex or a walled city, they're going to build a battle tower. Right? The battle tower, which usually would look something like this, is sort of a tall wooden structure that if you're able to climb to the top through the internal stairs, would get you a position over the walls of what you're trying to attack. So you can fire missiles inside the city or the camp. And not only that, but you can even see here in the illustration that there would be a battering ram as part of the battle tower, and that would smash into the walls that we are kind of sitting in here. You can see the external walls, and try to then create an opening for the rest of the troops to come up and attack. Okay? But there's one small catch. You cannot build a battle tower out of wood to reach from down there to up here. So what do you got to do? You build the ramp. Right? Everybody see here in the picture, there's a nice little ramp. So we're now going to move over to the western side of Masada, and we're going to see, looking in that direction, the man-made ramp that was constructed by the Roman forces, just so they could wheel that battle tower up higher to the defensive wall in order to go over it and through it. Okay?